Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Aging Without Ageism? Conceptual Puzzles and Policy Proposals by Greg Bognar and Axel Gosseries. Read by Ulf Bjorklund. Publisher's Note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Introduction. Greg Bognar and Axel Gosseries. This book aims to contribute to the essential and timely discussion on age, ageism, population aging, and public policy. It attempts to demonstrate the breadth of the challenges by covering a wide range of policy areas from healthcare to old age support, from democratic participation to education, from family to fiscal policy. It bridges the distance between academia and public life by putting into dialogue fresh philosophical analyses and new specific policy proposals. It approaches familiar issues such as age discrimination, justice between age groups, and democratic participation across the ages from novel perspectives. Our societies continue to rely extensively on age criteria, despite the fact that concern for age discrimination is not new. The U.S. Age Discrimination in Employment Act was adopted as far back as 1967. In Europe, age has been increasingly included in anti-discrimination legislation over the past several decades. Legal scholars, sociologists, anthropologists, and other social scientists have long studied how age structures our lives. Children's studies and gerontology are vast and well-established fields of scholarship. Yet, with few exceptions, practical philosophers have been less active than researchers from other disciplines on the age front. This book aims especially to contribute to filling this gap in dialogue with other disciplines. Two trends in particular render this a timely exercise. One is the ongoing process of critically scrutinizing our societies through the prism of race, gender, disability, and other categories. This call for looking at whether age is different, whether it is unique or, as it is sometimes put, special from a normative perspective. Can this explain that it tends to get less attention than other social categories? Should we worry less about differential treatment on grounds of age than about differential treatment based on race or gender? And if so, what are the difference makers that render age special from a normative perspective? The other trend that warrants a closer look at age is the aging of our societies. 15 years ago, fewer than 500 million people were 65 or older. In 2030, there will be more than 1 billion people over 65, and by 2050, there will be around 1.5 billion. During the past decade, the number of older people surpassed the number of children under 5 for the first time in human history. In 2015, Japan was the only country that had more than 30% of its population made up by those over 60. By 2050, this will become the case in all developed countries, including China. Population aging presents enormous challenges. Aging societies will have to make massive adjustments to their old age support and healthcare systems, their labor markets, and their social and political institutions. Population aging will have profound effects on family life, the nature of work, politics, and people's life plans. With no historical experience to rely on, societies will have to try untested, novel, and creative ways for coping with the challenges of aging. And they must be able to provide ethical justifications for their choices. Our aim is to provide a multidisciplinary discussion, with contributions especially from philosophy, but also inputs from political science, economics, sociology, and other areas. In order to impose some order on a wide-ranging collection of topics, we divided the book into 2 parts. The chapters in Part 1 present in-depth discussions of conceptual and normative issues. The chapters in Part 2 defend specific policy proposals, grounded in explicit normative arguments. Listeners interested in conceptual issues can begin at the beginning. Those more interested in policy alternatives can pick one of the chapters from Part 2 as their entry point. To help orientation, we provide separate overviews of the 2 parts. 1. Overview of Part 1. Part 1 departs from the fundamental normative question about age. Is unequal treatment on the basis of age permissible? How does it differ from an ethical point of view from other forms of differential treatment? Age discrimination has been a neglected area in the literature on wrongful discrimination in philosophy and legal theory. The first 3 chapters aim to fill some of the gaps by approaching the fundamental normative question from different directions. What do different theories of wrongful discrimination have to say about the wrongness of age discrimination specifically? How is age discrimination connected to disability discrimination? How should we think about the link between paternalism and age? In the opening chapter of Part 1, Age Discrimination, Is It Special? Is It Wrong?, Katarina Bernt Rasmussen examines the morality of age discrimination by bringing together philosophical theories of wrongful discrimination and accounts of the specialness of age, that is, defenses of the claim that there is a moral difference between discrimination on the basis of age and discrimination on other grounds, such as gender or race. After providing an overview of considerations that might make age special, Bernt Rasmussen offers a taxonomy of different forms of age discrimination and relates them to 3 theories of wrongful discrimination. She finds that these 3 theories differ with respect to their moral assessment of various forms of age discrimination due to the different roles that specialness consideration plays in each. Rather than arguing for any particular theory, however, Bernt Rasmussen concludes by offering a template for identifying, analyzing, and morally evaluating different forms of age discrimination. In the second chapter, Kasper Lippert Rasmussen compares age discrimination and disability discrimination. Does the badness of disability differ from that of old age? He begins with a familiar question from the philosophy of disability. To the extent that being disabled is worse than being non-disabled, is this largely because of factors that are independent of the social environment, the disability as bad difference view, or largely because of the ableist nature of the social environment, the disability as mere difference view? Correspondingly, we might ask, to the extent that being old is worse than being young, is this largely because of factors that are independent of the social environment, or largely because of the ageist nature of the social environment? Are the answers to these questions related? If they are, how? Lippert Rasmussen considers whether, if we are inclined to accept the view that the disadvantages of disability are largely caused by an ableist social environment, we should also accept the view that the disadvantages of old age are largely caused by an ageist social environment. He thinks we should. But Lippert Rasmussen argues that the view that ageist social environments are primarily responsible for the disadvantages of old age should be rejected. Therefore, we should also reject the view that ableist social environments are primarily responsible for the disadvantages of disability. Yet, while insisting that our views on disability constrains those we adopt on age, Lippert Rasmussen also stresses that we should not overstate the importance of taking a stance on the mere difference and bad difference divide. Rather, we should pay more attention to the specific ways old age and disability cause disadvantage, instead of trying to defend broad generalizations about what family of causes predominates. The third chapter examines age discrimination from the perspective of age-differentiated paternalism. Many of us share the intuition that paternalism is less problematic when applied to children rather than to the elderly. One interest of Vicky Müller-Lyngby Pedersen's chapter in defense of age-differentiated paternalism is that she stresses that we need to consider not only the dimensions of competence and voluntariness, but also the magnitude of the good promoted by paternalistic interventions. While this dual account does not generally challenge common-sense intuitions about paternalism, it introduces additional complexity when evaluating paternalistic interventions in a wide range of cases. The chapter considers many examples, from age-differentiated rules for access to sterilization, through age-differentiated fines for not using a helmet, to age-differentiated prices for cigarettes. Those especially interested in these issues may also want to listen to Chapter 8 on paternalism and conceptions of childhood, Chapter 12 on paternalism in assisted reproduction and social freezing, or Chapter 13 on anti-paternalism in compulsory education. The remaining chapters in Part 1 take up issues of distributive justice. They consider the connection between age and different methods of policy evaluation. They examine the role of age in egalitarian theories of distributive justice. They ask whether it is justified that modern welfare states spend more on the elderly than on other age groups. Explore the implications of the idea that principles of distributive equality should apply to whole lives rather than particular segments or stages in life, and defend the view that social insurance systems should be age-balanced, offering similar levels of income replacement across age-related social risks. In Age and the Social Value of Risk Reduction, 3 Perspectives, Matthew D. Adler compares 3 frameworks of policy analysis from the perspective of fatality risk reduction for different age groups. Do they imply that the value of risk reduction depends on age? And how do they relate age to other factors? The 3 frameworks are utilitarianism, prioritarianism, and cost-benefit analysis. Adler finds that the value of risk reduction decreases with age, but increases with income according to utilitarianism. It decreases even more sharply with age according to prioritarianism, but prioritarianism can also neutralize the effect of income. And for cost-benefit analysis, the value of risk reduction increases with income even more sharply than for utilitarianism, while it first increases and then decreases with increasing age. None of the frameworks, therefore, is neutral with respect to age. They value fatality risk reduction differently, depending on a person's age and income. Prioritarianism is the only approach that can neutralize the effect of income and put higher value of reducing risks to the young. That may be an attractive feature. Paul Bouhabib, in his chapter Can Egalitarians Justify Spending More on the Elderly?, takes an egalitarian approach to age and fair distribution. He argues that the fact that modern welfare states devote a disproportionate amount of their budget to the needs of the elderly raises a puzzle. People who reach old age are often, on the whole, more fortunate than those who don't because they have enjoyed a longer life. In devoting disproportionate expenditure towards their needs, the welfare state thus appears to be privileging the needs of those who are more fortunate than others. Bouhabib examines the response to this puzzle provided by relational egalitarians, who hold that we should care not only about how the welfare state distributes resources between persons, but also about whether it protects people from mistreatment by others. Relational egalitarians justify disproportionate expenditure on the elderly on the grounds that it is necessary to protect them against domination and marginalization, among other forms of mistreatment. But Bouhabib finds that the relational egalitarian response does not solve the puzzle. He proposes a different solution based on 2 claims. First, suffering is intrinsically bad and should be prevented, even when it is experienced by persons who are more fortunate than others. Second, disproportionate expenditure on the needs of the elderly is a form of insurance that all persons would have purchased in fair circumstances. In his chapter, Age Limits and the Significance of Entire Life's Egalitarianism, Axel Gosseries focus on the claim that principles of distributive justice should be applied to whole lives. That is, to determine what we owe to people as a matter of fair distribution, we need to consider how they fare during their entire lives. Gosseries provides an overview of the entire life view and explores its possible underlying intuitions. He separates the defensive version of the view, which argues that some age limits are not objectionable, from an affirmative one, which argues that some age limits are actually desirable. He concludes that while age limits tend to provide one of the best illustrations of the practical relevance of the entire life debate, the latter does not necessarily offer us insights that are as significant as expected to defend age limits over their whole range. Part 1 closes with a more empirically oriented chapter. It starts with the observation that welfare states differ greatly in the extent to which they provide social protection for various age-related social risks. They set different priorities between needs associated with childhood, maturity, and old age. In Age Universalism Will Benefit All Ages, Simon Birnbaum and Kenneth Nelson explore and defend the ideal of age universalism in social insurance, according to which the degree of income replacement should be similar across age-related social risks. The arguments suggest pragmatic advantages of age-balanced social insurance, showing that it tends to provide higher levels of income replacement for age-related risks throughout the life cycle and achieve more favorable social outcomes in all age groups with respect to poverty rates, trust, and subjective well-being. 2. Overview of Part 2. The chapters in Part 2 have a more policy-oriented focus. They cover a range of topics from different perspectives. The topics include political participation, education, healthcare, retirement, and old age social services, as well as taxation and inheritance. The first cluster of chapters is on political participation and voting rights. The chapters address whether and how disenfranchising the young can be justified on the basis of different conceptions of childhood, whether the voting driving analogy can justify disenfranchising the old, and whether giving extra weight to the young in political decision-making can be a plausible avenue to addressing concerns about political short-termism. In the first chapter, Let Them Be Children, Age Limits in Voting and Conceptions of Childhood, Anka Gauss explores alternative views about the nature and value of childhood and their relevance to the issue of children's voting rights. In particular, she contrasts one view that regards childhood as a mere deficiency and as preparation time for adulthood, with a family of views that emphasizes the value of goods unique to childhood, such as playfulness and carefreeness. Defenders of deficiency views tend to assume that the lack of agency is an unqualified bad for children and neglect ways in which childhood allows access to other sources of value. Gauss maps out how the different accounts bear on arguments for and against enfranchising children. She also explains why children who live in a society in which many adults fail to comply with their duties of intergenerational justice have a weightier interest in voting, and hence why the case for children's enfranchisement is stronger in such circumstances. The next chapter continues to explore political participation by looking at the other end of life. Should there be an age limit such that people over it lose their eligibility to vote? After all, loss of ability is often used to justify restricting people's freedom. For instance, age-related loss of ability is used to justify the requirement of periodic renewal of driving licenses, and could result in the loss of driving permit for the elderly, limiting their freedom of movement. Can there be an analogous case for voting? In Age and the Voting Driving Analogy, Alexandru Volacu asks this question. He examines arguments by analogy in general and formulates such an argument linking driving and voting. He considers different ways the argument could be applied to age-adjusted voting rights. However, in the end, he finds that there are significant dissimilarities between driving and voting. Thus, Volacu concludes that the argument is unsuccessful. In Empowering Future People by Empowering the Young, Tyler M. John argues that the state is plagued with problems of political short-termism, excessive priority given to near-term benefits at the expense of benefits further in the future. Political scientists and economists reckon that political leaders rarely look beyond the next 2 to 5 years, exacerbating problems such as climate change and pandemics. What can be done to counter this? One possible mechanism involves apportioning greater relative political influence to the young. The idea is that younger citizens generally have greater additional life expectancy than older citizens, and thus it looks reasonable to expect that they have preferences that are extended further into the future. If we give greater relative political influence to the young, our political system might exhibit greater concern for the future. But John shows that giving greater political power to the young is unlikely in itself to make states significantly less short-termist. No empirical relationship has been found between age and willingness to support long-termist policies. Instead, he proposes a more promising age-based mechanism. States should develop youth citizens' assemblies that ensure accountability to future generations through a scheme of retrospective accountability. Policymakers would be rewarded in the future in proportion to the effects of their policies on the long run. This would incentivize them now to choose policies that have the best long-term consequences. The second couple of chapters in Part 2 are on healthcare. The first is Greg Bognar's chapter on COVID-19, Age and Rationing. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some hospitals found themselves short of ventilators, intensive care units, ICU beds, and qualified medical personnel to take care of patients. Physicians had to make difficult life and death choices. They were aided by various guidelines and recommendations issued by governments and medical associations. Bognar reviews some of these guidelines, looking in particular at the role of age and life expectancy as criteria for the rationing of healthcare resources. He defends the view that the ethical aim of triage should be to maximize benefits, and concludes that while neither age nor life expectancy should be used to categorically exclude patients, both may have a role in triage by virtue of their connection to capacity to benefit. Francesca Minerva's chapter, Ageism in Assisted Reproduction, begins from the fact that female fertility declines at a much faster rate than male fertility, while in the past decades assisted reproduction treatments, ARTs, have dramatically increased women's chances of getting pregnant over the age of 35. It remains very difficult for women above their mid-40s to get pregnant, given that ART success rates decrease with increasing age. Moreover, many European countries legally prevent women over the age of 45 from accessing ARTs. Minerva opposes upper age limits on ARTs for women, rejecting three arguments that are based, respectively, on paternalism, to protect the mother's health, the link between age and increased risk of abnormalities for the child, and the diminished ability of older parents to take care of children. She also calls for a more proactive policy, including free access to social freezing and investment in research into ways of delaying menopause. In the following chapter, Andréane Cormier and Harry Brighouse propose an education resource account for early school leavers. They argue that school should cease to be compulsory at age 16, and that an education resource account, ERA, should be established for students who leave school at that age. The ERA will be sufficient to cover 3 years of full-time education. It could be linked to inflation, and early school leavers could use it in accredited non-profit educational institutions at any later point in their lives. Two sets of arguments support the proposal. The first, building on the empirical literature, focuses on efficiency and highlights the advantages of an ERA with respect to the disruptive students issue in particular. The second set of arguments is anti-paternalistic. Cormier and Brighouse distinguish three anti-paternalistic arguments. The view that individuals are the best judges of their own welfare, also discussed in Chapter 3. The idea that autonomous decision-making is a component of well-being, and a respect-based view of what renders anti-paternalism wrong. While they endorse the latter two arguments, their ERA proposal still has a mildly paternalistic dimension, since its funds can only be used for education purposes. Vincent van der Berghe takes up the issue of retirement in differentiating retirement age to compensate for health and longevity inequality. As he points out, usually a uniform age is used to proxy work capacity loss and trigger the payment of pensions. Recently, however, some have argued that we need several retirement ages to better match the distribution of work incapacity across socio-demographic groups. At first sight, this proposal makes perfect sense. Work capacity declines faster among low-income and low-educated individuals. But there is also a lot of unaccounted heterogeneity, even inside narrowly defined socioeconomic groups. And this compromises the feasibility and desirability of retirement age differentiation. Under a regime of systematic retirement age differentiation, there would be many situations with no retirement for people with serious work restrictions, and simultaneously, numerous cases where entirely healthy people enjoy retirement. An alternative approach would be to stick to a uniform retirement age, backed up by a reinforced disability scheme. Old age also takes center stage in Kim Angel's Aging in Place and Autonomy. Is the age-friendly city initiative too elderly-friendly? Angel is concerned with the age-friendly cities initiative aimed at enhancing people's opportunity to age in place. He presents an autonomy-based defense of the idea and examines the moral claim that the elderly can make in support of their ability to age in place. He emphasizes, among other considerations, that aging in place can have cognitive benefits through the routines and habits made possible by familiar environments. He argues, however, that the claims of the elderly can come into conflict with the claims of the young. We should not only look at today's elderly, but also anticipate how today's young will fare when they get old. Angel appeals to the cohort-specific predictions by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, such that, for example, today's young are expected to be worse off when old than the currently old, to make the case for an all-age-friendly or even young-friendly interpretation of the Age-Friendly Cities Initiative, while also insisting on the importance of policies benefiting low-income families, regardless of age, and promoting intergenerational housing initiatives. The last cluster of chapters in the book focuses on age and taxation, looking respectively at housing, income, and bequests. In his chapter, An Age-Based Delayed Housing Wealth Tax, Daniel Halliday considers taxation and housing wealth. Popular narratives around aging and intergenerational inequality suggest that young people increasingly tend to subsidize older people, in spite of enjoying poorer economic prospects. One specific concern is that older and younger birth cohorts are unequally situated with respect to the distribution of housing wealth, as well as the distribution of the tax burden. Halliday addresses this concern by proposing an age-based delayed housing wealth tax. The idea is that once homeowners reach a certain age, they are charged some portion of their home's value on an annual basis, which would eventually be paid to the tax office upon the death of the surviving spouse. This tax can be avoided by downsizing to a home of lesser value, and thereby freeing up housing to be purchased by younger people. Retaining a valuable home means instead incurring a tax liability that can be used to fund the benefits consumed by retirees. A delayed housing wealth tax can be designed to accommodate variables, such as couples who differ in age, or single retired home owners. Halliday argues that this proposal compares favorably with alternatives, such as inheritance taxation, for getting older people to absorb the costs of their care. Just as in the previous chapters, access to housing for the young is a central concern. In his chapter, Manuel Savalenche distinguishes between two types of age-sensitive taxation. One is a form of cumulative income taxation, which taxes annual income, taking into account all earlier income years instead of just the last one. The other is an explicitly age-differentiated scheme that taxes annual income adjusted by a rate that depends on the taxpayer's age. The chapter first presents reasons to support cumulative income taxation and examines how it would affect fiscal obligations across life. Then it argues that maximin egalitarians, that is, egalitarians who give absolute priority to improving the situation of the least well-off, should aim at a hump-shaped tax rate across people's lives. Such a rate reflects a concern about both early death and poverty in old age, hence focusing on the young and the elderly, not the middle-aged. The chapter questions whether cumulative income taxes can deliver this result without resorting to explicitly age-differentiated taxes. It reaches the conclusion that while cumulative income taxation can benefit the young, including the short-lived among them, age-differentiated taxes are necessary to protect the elderly poor. In the final chapter, Pierre Pestiot and Gregory Pontier presents 4 arguments supporting an age-differentiated tax on bequests, that is, a tax rate on inheritance that varies with the age of the deceased. The arguments are based on different ethical foundations and lead to an inheritance tax that can either increase or decrease with the age of the deceased. Pestiot and Pontier make the case for an age-differentiated tax based on the idea of compensating unlucky prematurely dead persons. Their view supports a bequest tax that increases with the age of the deceased. Along with chapters 5 and 17, their chapters illustrates the many normative problems that differential longevity raises. Together, these chapters provide us with a sense of the complexity of the issues at stake. The account we accept about the wrongness of discrimination makes a difference to which age-based policies can be defended. So does the view of paternalism we take and, more generally, the background theory of justice we endorse. It matters whether we consider differential longevity unfair, whether we are concerned with equality between entire lives or parts of lives, whether we hold that differential treatment by age is relevantly similar to unequal treatment by race, gender, or disability. The justification of age-based policies.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?